Vicki Jimpson-Fludd, Executive Director of the African American Archive of Columbia County. I would like to welcome you to the second in our series of 4 lectures. This series, titled In Perspective, seeks to put into historical and sociological context the lived experiences of enslaved and freed people in the Hudson Valley. Today, we welcome Dr. Andrea Mosterman, Associate Professor in Atlantic History and Joseph Triegel Professor of Early American History at the University of New Orleans. In her work, Dr. Mosterman researches slavery and the slave trade in the Dutch Atlantic world with an emphasis on early New York. Her research has been published in various academic and public-facing publications. Her book, Spaces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, won the 2020 Hendricks Award for Best Book-Length Manuscript relating to New Netherland and the Dutch colonial experience. The book uses spatial analysis to examine enslavement and resistance in New York's Dutch communities. Dr. Mosterman is currently researching the voyage of the Gideon, a Dutch slave ship, and the 7th century Dutch Atlantic slave trade with North America. In today's lecture, Dr. Mosterman will discuss slavery and resistance in Dutch New York. In her presentation, she will explore the history of slavery and resistance in Dutch New York, with special attention to Kinderhook and surroundings. Through the examination of Dutch American homes, Dutch Reformed churches, and public spaces in the predominantly Dutch American communities, she shows how Dutch American enslavers increasingly used their dominance over these spaces to control the people they enslaved, while the enslaved people resisted such control by escaping or modifying these spaces and expanding their mobility and activities within them. Such close analysis of enslavement in these spaces reveals that by the mid-18th century, slavery in New York was an advanced system of violence and control that had much in common with that of slave societies in the plantation South. Now, without further ado, here is Dr. Mosterman.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you to the African American Archive, Columbia County site, and of course the library. It's my second time here at the Hudson Area Library within a year. I never expected to visit Hudson that often in such a short time period, and it's really lovely to be back. So I'll be speaking about the lives of enslaved people in predominantly the Hudson Valley, but really my research focuses on New York as a whole, and in particular Dutch communities. So you'll hear about other parts of New York as well. And it focuses on this topic in the context of spaces of enslavement, which was the focus of my book. And so I'll be focusing in particular on the public space, the home and the church in the 18th and early 19th century. So I'm kind of leaving the 17th century behind, but if anybody has questions about that, I would be happy to answer them, as I do pay attention to those in my research, just not for the lecture today. So I'll start briefly with just looking at slavery in New York and giving a little bit of a context. What are we really looking at? So these are some of the percentages of enslaved people per New York County according to the 1790 census. And 1790 is around the period when really slavery in New York peaks. So you see it increase over the course of the 18th century. And then of course, by 1799, when we see the gradual emancipation of slavery in the area, it decreases slowly until it's completely abolished by 1827. It starts really expanding in the latter part of the 17th century, when for the first time we see it really increasing across these areas along the Hudson Valley, and really increasing amongst individual settlers. So in the 17th century, during the Dutch colonial period, we see that there's a majority of enslaved people actually enslaved by the Dutch West India Company, but in the 18th century, this really becomes very prominent amongst settlers and also Dutch descendants among them. Now, you'll see on this graph that the averages of percentages really vary. There's 1% in Ontario County and Clinton County, versus 31% in Kings County. So that is what today is Brooklyn, New York. And that, of course, was then, much higher than in many of the other areas. What's important, though, is that we look at a more local breakdown. So, for example, for Columbia County, you'll see that it is about 5.8% of the population that's enslaved in 1790. But if you break it down for the different towns, you'll actually see that in some of those areas, it's much higher than that. So in Hillsdale and Canaan, which are both really close to the Massachusetts border, which by 1790 in Massachusetts, slavery had been abolished. The areas closer to the Hudson River, it is closer to 10%, and in Kinderhook, even almost 16%. So it really depends also within Columbia County where you are. And this is per county. You'll see that the breakdown really differs per area. Now, like I said, in the latter part of the 17th century into the 18th century, we see that slavery expands in New York, now an English colony. And with that comes increased legislation that limits the movements of enslaved people. And so this really affects how enslaved people can move and their activities within the public spaces of New York. So enslaved New Yorkers are no longer allowed to move from point A to B without having a pass that shows that they have permission to do so. They're no longer allowed to meet in groups larger than 3 or 4, depending on where and the time period. They're no longer allowed to purchase alcohol or sell goods without permission from their enslavers. So on all of these different levels, we see that their movements and activities in public spaces are increasingly controlled, surveilled, and prohibited. Now, patrols, watchmen, and pass systems were used to enforce such legislation in these public spaces. And so one of these examples is a patrol, and this is in Ashangang, which is this particular society was established in 1796, so really toward the latter part of the 18th century. This was organized by residents to have a society that will retrieve any people that try to flee their enslavers. And what it meant was that they would have to, any enslaver would have to register the enslaved people that they wanted to have the possibility to have these watchmen, these patrols, these riders, as they called them actually in this document, to search for these people. So if one of these people ran away from them, then they would be able to get a rider to look for them, and organized by the Society of Apprehending Slaves. And so this is in Shangang, but we see similar organizations throughout New York. Now, there were also pass systems. And so this meant that if you were traveling from A to B, you always had to show that you, in fact, had permission from your enslaver to do so. Or if you were a free person, then you would have to prove that you were a free person. This particular example is from Sylvia Du Bois. And I should note that Sylvia Du Bois actually was an enslaved woman from New Jersey, but for a large part of her life actually was enslaved in Pennsylvania. So this is not necessarily pertaining to New York itself, but the broader region, and it shows the experiences of enslaved people with these pass systems. And I think it's useful in this context because we have so few accounts by enslaved people themselves, right? So this is actually a photograph of Sylvia Du Bois, who talks about the fact that as an enslaved person, you always had to be able to show your pass. And you see here that she also says in those days, anybody had authority to arrest vagrant Negroes. They got paid for arresting them and charges for their keeping till their masters redeemed them. And so this meant that not just these organized patrols or watchmen in the cities, you oftentimes had watchmen who were in charge of this, not just them, they were not the only ones who would be able to stop any enslaved person or really any Black person to demand that they show that they actually legitimately move from space to space. It could be any white person who could do this, and they actually could get a reward for doing so. Now, even though the movements of enslaved people within these public spaces were very much controlled then through these past systems, through legislation, we see that enslaved people are still very much moving through the cities and through the more rural areas. And they do so by using alternative ways to move through those spaces. So in cities, they would be moving via alleyways, backyards. There's legislation that reasserts that enslaved people are not allowed to sell goods, and it actually mentions that they do so in outhouses, which is against the law. So we see that they are still moving through these spaces, but they do so in ways that they are not noticed as much as they would be going via the regular roads. And there's one account where this actually becomes very clear, and it's from Bet. Bet was one of the 3 enslaved people who were held accountable for the fire of 1793 that destroyed several bucks in Albany, New York. In her testimony, where she actually admits to having put on fire Peter Ganstervoort's barn, I believe it was, in the back of the house, but that's where the fire started. She actually talks about how they organized this, how they moved through the city. And it's fascinating to learn. She talks about how they actually waited to meet in the kitchen of one of the enslavers, and they know that there would be no oversight in that kitchen. Then they waited for Albany's watchmen to pass because they knew exactly what time they would pass by that place. Then they moved to Ganstervoort's house via back roads, alleyways. And so it really gives us some insight into how enslaved people still were able to navigate those spaces without being seen. By really using those space in different ways. And we would see the same thing in rural areas where people would, and oftentimes having a very great understanding of the landscape, they would move through this landscape in a way that they would be unnoticed or less noticed. And this is part of a newspaper article that actually notes that they would be executed, both, all 3 of them eventually would be executed for having set this, having started this fire. Now, interestingly enough, even though we see this control over the movement and activities of enslaved people in public spaces, there is also the Pinkster celebration. And I'm sure many of you have heard of Pinkster, if not everybody. When I first started working on this research, whenever I would submit anything for publication, they would ask, well, what about Pinkster? Like that was always one of the things people always wanted to hear about. And so Pinkster was this celebration in many parts of New York. Its most famous one was in Albany, where enslaved people would come together for several days to celebrate. They would be able to drink alcohol, they would sell goods, they would have several days where they could come together in very large groups, everything completely opposite from what was actually allowed, right? Like where usually there would not be, they would not be permitted to meet with more than 3 or 4 people. Now they were able to meet in large groups. They usually would not be allowed to purchase alcohol. Now they could sell goods. And what I believe is important here to think about is that when the fact that Pinkster was this one opportunity where they could do all that was that it was very much in a controlled environment. So yes, they could come together for several days in this one space. In the case of Albany, it was on Pinkster Hill, which is today where the state capitol is. They could come together there and do all those things that usually would be against the law. But it was very much in a controlled environment. And so it was not seen as a threat. Yet there was a lot of surveillance actually at the Pinkster Festival. Yet it was believed that having this yearly celebration where enslaved people could do those things served as some scholars have said, like a safety valve, like a way for enslavers to be able to control enslaved people more so during the rest of the year, because they had this one moment that they could look forward to. And so for enslaved people, this was a very important celebration, because not only could they do those things, like they could be together, they could celebrate together, they could meet with their family and loved ones, people that in many cases they rarely had an opportunity to see during Pinxter, they would be able to gather in these public spaces for celebration. And for anybody who doesn't know about Pinxter, so this is during Pentecost or Whitsuntide. Pinkster is the Dutch word for, we call it Pinksteren, but it's the Dutch word for Pentecost. And you see here an excerpt from the Pinkster Ode, and it's just a small part, but they will talk about, like, there was an African king, King Charlie in Albany, who would parade down the streets. They would then gather on a hill where they would sell goods, dance, celebrate together. And we know that in the Hudson Valley, Sojourner Truth talks about celebrating Pinxter. So it was celebrated in many of these different areas and in different but similar ways. So on this map, it was in this area. Now, what's important to note is that in that same area were also the gallows where Bethlehem and Pompey, who were held responsible for that fire in Albany, were executed. And so I believe that in many cases, we actually see this, that the Pinxter celebrations were very close to where the gallows were. And so I believe that that was one way of reminding the enslaved people, like, listen, you have this moment of freedom, but don't try to take advantage of that because you will be punished. And that was that reminder of actually having those architectures of violence, like right there in that same space. So moving on to the home then and enslavement within the home, because a lot of enslaved people were mostly contained to those homes and the immediate area and the smaller communities that they were in. When we look again at that, this is the same record, that the same graph that I showed you earlier, like a breakdown of Columbia County. And again, like it varies a lot, right? Where and how many enslaved people actually were per the different town. Now, if we look at it in terms of how many households enslaved people, you get these for Kinderhook and Hudson. So it would be a lot less in Hillsdale, for example, but in Hudson, just over 25% of the households enslaved people within their homes. And in Kinderhook, that would have been 27%. So, 1 in 4, a little over 1 in 4 families actually enslaved people within their homes. And so one of the questions that I looked at in my research was, what did that mean? Where would enslaved people have lived, and how would they have been able to move through those spaces, and what would their experiences have been within those spaces? And this comes in part because we oftentimes, when we visit these historic sites of some of those homes that are still remaining, we get reminded of, and I have to say, this is changing a lot, right? So the way that historical interpretation is handled at a lot of these historic sites is very different. But oftentimes when I started this research, still, it was like, look at this great home and the history of the Dutch in New York and beautiful architecture. But it never was really considered what the experiences of enslaved people would have been like in those spaces. So I have a few examples here. One, not Hudson Valley, this is Kings County, so Brooklyn, New York, but it's one of these rare sites where we actually are pretty sure we know where enslaved people lived in the home. This is the Lott House, and this was built in the 1730s, this structure. And then this lean-to was added not long after that. This was a lean-to kitchen. This is not in the picture because it was added in the early 1800s. So we're looking really at this building and this area. So this was a one-room structure with an attic where the Lott family would have slept. And then this lean-to kitchen was where the kitchen would be located. A few decades ago, they accidentally found out when somebody, I think it was like a groundskeeper, was in this lean-to building, discovered that in a closet there, you could actually move the ceiling, and there was a little stairwell that you could pull out. And they hadn't really realized this for a while because it is very small. It's a very small area, but that opened up to this little stairwell, pointing at my computer screen, I can't see that. This stairwell right here And on both sides were small garret spaces, and this is one of them on the left side. I visited this space and took pictures with my iPhone, and you can barely see. Like it's very, very dark in those spaces. There's no natural light whatsoever. These were photographs taken by a professional photographer. That's why we can see this space so well in these images. Now, when archaeologists did research there in those garret spaces, they found that enslaved people had very likely lived there. And there's a variety of reasons why they believe that. They found wax, they found a beehive-shaped oven in right there where the chimney was running through that one space. They also found locks on the outside of the door of the garret spaces. I believe, I don't know if it was both of them, but it was for sure this one had a lock on the outside. They also found that under the floorboards, and you can kind of see it here, various things were placed there, probably ritually placed, corn cobs and a cloth pouch with a goat pelvis and an oyster shell, as well as a child's shoe, which Walter Wheeler, I believe it is, who writes about this, something that happened in a lot of New York homes, that shoes were actually placed in those in-between spaces as a way to safeguard spaces. Now, so when you go into this space, like really it takes your breath away. I did not go in, like there's no way that I could even like try to fit myself in this space. It's very small. And just the thought that that would have been the space where enslaved people would have lived, and very likely all of the people enslaved by the Lott family in the latter part of the 18th century, and you see their names here, Mary, Hannah, Mel, Kate, Harry, Hector, Powell, and the children, we don't know if it was their children, but the children, Cyrus, Jan, Jacob, Hannah, and Paul, all lived in those two garret spaces. Likely all lived in those garret spaces. So no natural light, you could not stand up in those spaces. Very small, a lot of people, it would have been very hot in the summers. In the winters, the garret space on the left side that you see here, it would have had that heat because of the chimney running through, but the other garret space did not have that, so that one would have been very cold. You know, a very different experience from living anywhere else in that house. And that would have been the same at the Schuyler Mansion. The idea that, you know, the experience for the enslaved people in the spaces where they lived and spent most of their time were very different from where the Schuyler family would have spent their time. And I'm sure some of you have visited Schuyler Mansion. It's a beautiful home. When you come in through the front door, so right there, you'll see a beautiful large hallway, very high ceilings, large stairwell going up to the second floor, rooms on both sides of the hallway, all very beautiful, tall windows, lots of natural light, a gorgeous home. But the enslaved people very likely spent very little time in those spaces. They would have spent most of their time in the back of the house and in the cellar. And you can see here on this model that the back of the Schuyler Mansion was a walled courtyard, which likely was a way to contain and control the movements and activities of the enslaved people and the people enslaved by the Schuyler family. This home was built in the 1760s when the Schuyler family, and I say the Schuyler family, so Philip Schuyler, right? Also known as Alexander Hamilton's father-in-law. I think he's now most famous for that, since the Hamilton musical. But so built in the 1760s, at that time, the Schuyler family already had held several people in bondage. And so when they built this home, they knew that they were going to house those enslaved people in that space. So they built the house. They had this walled courtyard. There was an outdoor kitchen that was used to prepare the foods. There was a way to go in from the back of the home that would lead into the dining room. There's a little pantry area, if I remember correctly, and then into the dining room. And the cellar, which had an entry, and this is the back of the home, picture I took, there was an entry only like on the back side of the home into that cellar. So the enslaved people would not have been able to enter Schuyler Mansion if that was closed. There was no indoor passageway of any sort. So not only were the enslaved people rarely in those beautiful sites, they would have spent most of their times in the cellar or in the back of the home. They also had their movements and their labor very much controlled. You could actually, from these back windows, see that courtyard very well, creating kind of like the panopticon, where there's this, even if you're not surveilled, there's always the notion that you're possibly surveilled, that people might be watching you and looking what you're doing. Now, I wanted to include the Van Allen house. From the little research that I've done, it's very likely that the enslaved people also lived in the cellar of the Van Allen house. It had a kitchen in the cellar, as many New York homes had. So that would have been one of their main labor areas of labor, food preparation and cooking and such. And so it's most likely that they also would have lived in that cellar. It is possible that they would have lived in an attic. And in some cases, we do also see in New York that there was an outdoors building where enslaved people lived, or actually a slave cabin. There are some advertisements that actually mention that, but it's very rare. So in the case of the Van Allen house, my guess would be it would have been in the cellar. And we do see along the Hudson River that in most cases, it's in the attic or the cellar where enslaved people would have been housed. Now, we saw what the attic looked like at the Lott house, but what were these cellars like? Well, we know from Sojourner Truth, her description of the cellar where she grew up in Ulster County, New York. And she writes about this, that its only lights consisted of a few panes of glass through which she thinks the sun never rose, but with thrice reflected rays, and the space between the loose boards of the floor and the uneven earth below was often filled with mud and water. So again, very few accounts from enslaved people and their experiences, but here is one of them that gives us a little bit of an insight into at least what those circumstances were for her in the cellar where she grew up, and very likely similar to what was the case in other New York homes. Now, even though these were oftentimes very tight, very cold or hot spaces, very little privacy for enslaved people in those spaces, oftentimes with several people were placed in one area. I actually saw one case where 4 people lived in a closet, and it was a couple and 2 other men. It didn't give me an indication of what type of closet this was, but it shows how, different people would have been staying within these spaces, so very little privacy. We know that even though that's where enslaved people spent their times, those hours that they were not working, we do see some evidence that they had their own ways of kind of making those spaces their own, or at least trying to safeguard those spaces. And here I just want to go back to what I mentioned about the Lott house and the items that they found under those floorboards. So again, you can see them here on the photograph. This picture is not fantastic, as you can see, but if you can see, there's corn cobs right here, and these are the oyster shell and the goat pelvis that they found in this cloth pouch that was under the floorboards. Now, the corn cobs were very likely ritually placed in a cross. There's some indication it may have been a star. Both were actually important religious symbols in several African religions. We also know that actually having these pouches with various items in them were very common in the African diaspora, like these cachets that you see actually in the South as well. And along the Atlantic coast in Africa, we see that people are using them. It was common in West Central Africa, in the Senegambia area, known as the Grigri in that area. These pouches that people either will wear on their body or bury, when possible, in the floor, in the ground, but not if that's not possible under floorboards, to protect those spaces. So the fact that they were actually very close to entry points, or placed close to entry points, suggests that they were really used to safeguard those spaces for the people living in them. Now, we also know that in other cases, people are just trying to flee those spaces, right? many cases. I mean, if you go through the advertisements, they're endless. I have not seen a New York paper, doesn't mean there aren't any, but I have not seen a New York paper from this era that did not have at least one of these advertisements in them that were looking for people that tried to flee their enslavers. And I found two from this particular area that I just wanted to share with you. One, Adam Allen of Kinderhook, who was looking for Hannibal, aged 25 years old. And the second one was Harry, who tried to flee John Upham of Claverack in 1771. Now, these advertisements give us one of the few kind of insights into the lives of enslaved people, and so they really give us a wealth of information. They are, of course, produced by these enslavers who are looking for them, right? Now, one thing that stands out in these advertisements is that sometimes they're so specific and describing sometimes very personal, private parts of the body, right? And so that also, going back to these patrols, like they would stop people, and based on these particular advertisements, they might ask to see parts of their body to see if they have any scarring or are, anything else, that like a missing toe, like they could demand to really check the body to see that, to be able to identify somebody. Now, here is one of an enslaved woman who, and this is another really important part when we think about slavery in New York, is that enslaved people were oftentimes separated from their family members. So those spaces, those houses that we oftentimes think of as spaces of family, right? For enslaved people, there was no way of knowing when your family, even if you were living with them, you might be separated at any point. And even children, babies, were separated from their mothers. Oftentimes, it was past the age of 1, but it could have been at an earlier age. And so here we see Diana, who was fleeing, and apparently she had gotten a pass from her enslaver to see her children. So she was not living with her children. She had gotten this pass to see her children. And then, according to this advertisement, took the opportunity or the advantage of, as it's kind of suggested here, right, of that opportunity to actually flee, try to run away with a 9-month-old baby. And she's certainly not the only one who's actually fleeing with her children. And again, it just shows how oftentimes, whereas we think of these homes as spaces as a family, for enslaved people, oftentimes they fled those homes to be with their family because they were not living with their families in those spaces. And this is also very, Sojourner Truth, again, one of the accounts we have from enslaved people themselves, and she discusses this in a way that it's really heartbreaking. And it just gives us an insight into this, the fact that this was always a possibility, that you would be separated from your children or other loved ones. She talks about this in her autobiography, which was in the third person, right? It was actually recorded by somebody else based on her narrative. And she talks about the moment when their enslaver passed away when she was a child, 8 years old, Charles Hardenberg. He passed away, and it's after his passing that she keeps finding her mother in tears. And I want to just read this part to you. So it says, after this event, the event being the death of Charles Hardenberg, she was often surprised to find her mother in tears. And when, in her simplicity, she inquired, "Mama, what makes you cry?" she would answer, "Oh, my child, I'm thinking of your brothers and sisters that have been sold away from me." And she would proceed to detail many circumstances respecting them. But Isabella, which was then the name of Sojourner Truth, long since concluded that it was the impending fate of her only remaining children, which her mother bit too well understood even then, that called upon those memories from the past and made them crucify her heart afresh. So Sojourner Truth here, her mother at that point already had lost several children who had been sold away. She only had 2 children left, Sojourner then still known as Isabella, and her brother. And she understood that with the passing of their enslaver, those last children would likely also be sold away, which happened. Both Sojourner Truth and her brother were sold at the auction block. Again, Sojourner was at that point 8 years old. So this was always a possibility, and everybody knew this, that whatever context you were in, if you had your loved ones close to you, physically close, you could lose them at any moment. And then, sometimes they would live maybe in the same community. Many times they would be anywhere along the Hudson River or much farther away. So I want to move on to the last part, the church, the last space. So I've talked about the public space, I've talked about the home, and now I just want to briefly talk about the church and the experiences of enslaved people within these Dutch Reformed churches, if they were allowed to worship in them. We see that in the 17th century, several enslaved people were actually worshiping in the Dutch Reformed Church of New Amsterdam. And by the latter part of the 17th century, this becomes increasingly rare. And in the 18th century, we see very few, especially up until the 1790s or so, we see very few enslaved people in Dutch Reformed Church records as members or marrying, baptizing in those churches. And one of the reasons very likely is that enslavers increasingly became worried that if they would allow the people they enslaved to become members in their church, that they might ask for their freedom, demand that they be free, because there was a lot of debate about can you really enslave a Christian? So we see in one case that Rachel, when she was actually admitted as a full member in 1703 in the Kingston Dutch Reformed Church, that there's actually an annotation, which is right here, to her baptism, to her admitting as a full member, that she promised that she shall serve her mistress, Catherine Cotain, loyally and humbly until Catherine's death, after which she would serve young Cotain for 8 more months before she would become free. So it's made very clear here in the record, right, that even if she is accepted as a full member in the church, that does not mean that she will get her freedom. She actually promises that she will not challenge her enslavement, right? Now, we also see that local congregations and enslavers were very worried about this, about admitting enslaved people in their churches, especially as full members. What does that mean? Can we still enslave them? Will that in some way challenge the racial hierarchies of our communities? And this is very evident in a letter by Peter Lowe, who actually was born in Kingston, of the Lowe family, and was one of the first people to actually go to the New Brunswick Seminary to become educated there and become a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church. He served as minister of the 6th congregation of Kings County, again, Brooklyn, what today is Brooklyn, New York. He was one of 2. So Martinus Schoonmaker was the other one. Martinus Schoonmaker would be, or Schoonmaker, how do you say it in English? He would be in charge of the Dutch services, and Peter Lowe would be in charge of the English services. In 1788, he gets a request from a group of Black men enslaved, I assume, because really the majority of people in Kings County at that point were enslaved. There were very few free Black people in that area at the time. And they requested to become full members in the church. And he writes about this request and the fact that his congregants objected to admitting them as full members and gave 10 main reasons why they were against admitting Blacks as full members. And I highlighted a few here. 4 of the 10. And I should note, I don't have his answer in this, but in the letter, under each objection, he gives an answer, and he does not agree with his congregation. He actually says that there's nothing in the Dutch Reformed Church that says that you cannot accept enslaved people in the church. And he actually states that, that they will understand that they're servants. And he himself actually also enslaved people, as did his fellow minister, Martinus Schoonmaker. So one of the objections, the first one, was that they would have no souls. Number 3, they are a curse of God. Number 4, they are a species very different from us. Witness their nausea, sweat, complexion, manners, etc. I cannot endure them near me. I would be ashamed to commune with them. That really shows also an objection to the close proximity in these spaces, right? Which is very odd, because these were the same people that lived within their homes and helped raise their children and cook their food, right? But when it's within this space of worship, they objected to that close proximity. And then there's objection 8. If many of them would be admitted, I tremble for the ark, a joy, order, and harmony in the Dutch church. See the absurd consequences. Negroes will at length summon their masters before the consistory, nay, will constitute a consistory themselves. What an awful sight. Negro elders, deacons, church masters, etc. So there they clearly show that they're worried that if they would allow Black members in the church, that might actually challenge the hierarchies within the church as well as society as a whole, right? They also claim that they would be too much like the Methodist Church if they would allow Black members. So a whole list of reasons why they would object to including Black members. And what I think is important here to note is that congregations had a lot of power over who is admitted into churches, right? And so the fact that this particular church, that they did not want these Black members in their church, does not mean that that was the case everywhere. And we see some churches, which I believe was the case here in Kinderhook as well, right? Where enslaved people were actually accepted within the church. But it really depended on the local congregation and whether or not they would be willing to do so. Now, again, I want to think about the space, like what did those spaces look like and where would enslaved people then really actually have worship? So here's an image of the Albany Church, the first church in Albany, in the second building, established in 1715. And so this is the outside, which was very typical for Dutch Reformed churches in the early 18th century and late 17th century. So usually a square or octagon, I think that's how you call it, would have been the shape. It would have a turreted roof with a belfry in the middle. It would have these galleries on the side, on the inside, an elevated pulpit. In the 250th anniversary of the Kinderhook Reformed Church, a publication to celebrate the 200th anniversary of that church, they actually suggest that the Kinderhook Church was modeled on this church, both the outside and the inside, so the seating arrangements as well. It actually mentions that the seating arrangements were very similar. So it assumed that it had a very similar layout to the first church of Albany. Now, during this period, there would have been very few enslaved people in these churches. If they were accepted in these churches, they oftentimes, I believe, we have very few records on this, but I believe would have been in the in-between spaces. So either they would have been with their enslaver, seated with their enslaver. In some cases, they may have been in the back seat. If they were there to assist their enslavers, whether that was to like refill the footstool that the women used, or to manage the horses while their enslavers were in church, they oftentimes would have been outside in the churchyard. It's not until the latter part of the 18th century that we see more enslaved people in these churches. And at that point, the layout of the churches has changed. One thing to note, the galleries were actually the most prominent seats in these churches. So that's actually where the men were seated. And there, I have records of that. One is in Kingston, New York. They actually explicitly say the men are in the galleries, except for the older men who were sitting on the first floor and the church elders. They usually were sitting there so that they could watch both the minister as well as the congregation. Now, in the latter part of the 18th century, this all changes. We see a lot of these churches, their layouts is changed, they are expanded, they become bigger, they become rectangular in shape. They have a bell tower, usually at the entrance. And then when you get into the church, the pulpit will be across from that. And you can see those changes, for example, at the Fishkill Church, which was erected in 1731. So that's the image of that church. And here is a layout of the church. So you can see that initially the entrance was on the side there. And you can see that if you go into that church, you can see that used to be the entrance and the pulpit would be across from that. Now it's turned rectangular. And so the entrance is at the back of the church. And we see the same changes in the Shangang Church, which is another church building that has undergone those changes, that's old enough to have undergone that. And there is where the entrance used to be. So in both of those cases, we see that they changed the shape, and by the early 19th century, most Dutch Reformed churches then will have like this more rectangular shape, which really is very common across the colonies. Well, then the early republic, it's a very kind of American style of churches. So a lot of denominations will have that as their architecture. As a part of that, also the pulpit is usually lowered and the galleries are lowered. And that is when we see also more enslaved people by the latter part of the 18th century with the Second Great Awakening. We do see that more enslaved people are accepted in these churches. And they oftentimes are restricted to the back of the church, first floor and second floor. And this is the New Paltz Church. This one was built in 1839. So actually after slavery had ended in New York. But it shows, they have the seating chart, and it shows actually where Black congregants were seated. So this is the chart for the first floor. This is the one for the second floor. And it says here that they are in these back seats. And you can also see it there. It actually, men and women were on each side. This is the area where they would have been seated, and this would have been the view from that seat of the church. And so as you can see, they would have been the farthest away, right, from the pulpit. Would have been hard to hear, to see what is going on. And there's several other churches where we have this information, where we can see that they were located in those back areas. And one of them is the Albany Church, the First Church of Albany, not the one that I showed you, but a later structure, the one that still stands today. And again, this is a picture from that area where they would have been seated. And even then, so even when they were segregated in those spaces, separated from white congregants, we see that there was always a tension there, as was here with Daniel Winner, who in 1815 informed the Treasury that he would pay for his pew, provided, quoting, the consistory will remove the Blacks from behind his pew, as was understood. And there's several references actually in the Albany church records where they asked for Black members to be moved to different parts of the church. So what does this mean for the enslaved people in these churches? They would be sitting, like I said, in these back areas, having a difficult time to actually hear the sermons, see what was going on. And we have some descriptions of this from New England. I don't have any from the New York area, but very similar circumstances have been described in New England churches. And as you can see, one of them, William Brown, he says that many attended no church at all because they said they were opposed to going to churches and sitting in pigeonholes, as all the churches at that time had some obscure place for the colored to sit in. And Cato Pierce, similarly, he said, and the gentleman I worked for went and showed me the box for the colored people. I pretty soon found out it was a Presbyterian church. I was so far off from the minister, and he preached by notes that I couldn't understand hardly anything he said. Now, we also know that even if they were accepted in those churches, in those separate spaces, there was also a temporal segregation, only allowed to go for communion after all white congregants had done. And I've seen this in several records in New York, and actually Peter Lowe mentions it in Objection 9, when people say they will intermix with white people at the Lord's table to their great offense. Peter Lowe actually says in his response, no, they won't. They'll have separate communion. And again, we don't have any descriptions of this in the case of New York, but Frederick Douglass talks about it in the case of New England again. And he writes about this I was anxious to observe the bearing of colored members, and the result was most humiliating. The white members went forward to the altar by the bench full, and when it was evident that all the whites had been served with the bread and wine, Brother Bonnie beckoned with his hand, exclaiming, "Come forward, colored friends, come forward. You too have an interest in the blood of Christ." And he talks about here about the humiliation, right? That within these spaces of worship, they would have to wait for all white members before they could get communion as well. Now, this is why it's not surprising that James Murphy, I don't know how many of you have heard of him. I don't know if he was discussed in the previous lecture. He was a minister at in Ulster County, the Clover-Warsing and Rochester churches. He was a Black man who had become free and got an education at the New Brunswick Seminary, and then became a minister at those churches in 1814. He did not let anybody know that he was Black. He was from Dutchess County. His mother was still living there when he was a minister. She was still enslaved, I believe, at the time. When congregants found out that their minister, and he already had been there for 10 years when they found this out, that their minister was not a white man, but was in fact a Black man, there were a lot of objections, and especially 3 congregants who would not let go and try to get him out of his seat, because initially eventually they say it's not because he's Black, but because he lied about his mother, because he had said that his mother had passed away. I believe that the fact that his mother was still alive made it for them more difficult to accept, because they couldn't just pretend he was a white man, because, you know, his Black mother was still very much alive. And, you know, when we think about the church and the space and kind of the acceptance or non-acceptance of enslaved people within those churches, the fact that there would have been a Black man, where usually they would either not be admitted or they would be seated in back benches of these churches, right? Here is a Black man who actually is preaching to them from the elevated pulpit, like even in an architectural level, it's very symbolic, right? And that they could not accept that is no surprise within the broader context then. He eventually does leave those churches. He also becomes the president of the Synod at some point, decades later, and is the first Black person to do so. But at New Brunswick, they did not know that they actually had a Black president of the Synod that early on, because it again had kind of disappeared from the record that he was a Black man. I think that the church in general kind of did not want to acknowledge that to avoid too much challenges on that level. So just a final note, even though enslaved people oftentimes were not allowed within these churches, as we saw at the Lot House, and in many other spaces, we see that they're still practicing their religions, right? Whether it is Christianity in various forms, they might be joining other churches, they might organize their own meetings. And we see that they're still practicing traditional African religions, as in the Lot House, with that cloth pouch, the placement of the corn cobs. And there's evidence in other spaces, like archaeological research has uncovered similar types of things in other spaces as well. So in all of these spaces, the house, the public space, the church, we see that there's an increasing segregation of enslaved people, control over enslaved people, surveillance. In all of those spaces, we also see that enslaved people are developing alternative ways of knowing and navigating those spaces. Oh, and that's it. And I don't know what just happened, but the last slide just disappeared on me. But that's it. Sorry. You know what happened? Oh, okay. There it's back. It's back. Yes, it's back. Sorry. Okay, there you go. So yes, thank you so much.
And it has been really fascinating, because you really brought a lot of things to life for us, especially because,
at the Lucas Van Allen House, you can see the slaves' quarters, you know, so it's right over in Kinderhook. We also know that in terms of the Dutch Reformed Church, even in Kinderhook, they had Black members, at least until the 1940s, if not later. We have a lot of records about that, where the Black people sat in the Kinderhook Church. Okay, this is Lee Flood Smith, who is the executive deputy director, and this is Peter Smith, her husband, who is our genealogist. And who is this?
Oh, Deborah Bruno.
Deborah
Right?
Bruno, okay.
Am I right? Yeah.
Okay. I don't know, do they have questions? Where are we with this room?
So the questions are on your laptop.
I need to get my glasses.
Okay. So there.
Okay, first question. From Roberta Nelson. I know that these are being recorded. Is there a way to view them if you can't make one live via Zoom or live? Oh, you've already answered that one. Okay. Can you address the occupations of enslaved people, just in sawmills, tanneries, shops, and how those spaces were arranged to accommodate them and perhaps white workers too?
I mean, that's a great question. I did, at some point, I wanted to look at workplaces and I did not. So I actually did not really research that. So I don't want to say too much about it, but I mean, one of the things that oftentimes is mentioned is how enslaved people and their enslavers would be working alongside each other, right? And I don't actually know how accurate that is. I think that it's similar to all the other things where there's this narrative about slavery in New York that has become very persistent. That's not necessarily true. So in the cases where people are living in agricultural areas, they would have been working on the farms, and enslaved women oftentimes actually working within the home. So a lot of the work was done in the home space and the surroundings. Interestingly, we see enslaved people who are actually transporting goods from one place to other, or people. So in the Schuyler family, we know that Lewis was actually transporting Benjamin Franklin back to New York City. And Franklin talks about this. So that would have been, you know, with limited oversight on his return to Albany. But in the workspaces, I mean, I imagine that oftentimes they were in close quarters with the person that enslavement, if they were working for a craftsman, or they would have been in you know, close spaces. But I don't know the specifics on this. Like I would want to research it more to really go into a spatial analysis here. So.
Do we have any questions from the audience?
I have a question. I'm a 7th grade social studies teacher in Kinderhook. So what would you think is a good message for me to be giving the kids who live in that town? Is there anything that I should stress more than anything else?
Okay, can we repeat this just for the online people?
Yeah, so she's asking if for 7th grade graders, as a teacher, if there's a way to teach them this history, right? Like things that are especially important. I mean, I think what is important to what people I think are really still grappling with is that slavery in New York was on an institutional level really not that different from slavery in other parts. So yes, the labor is different, the demographics are different, the circumstances in some ways are different, but any place where there's slavery, there's a system of violence that has to be in place and a system of control to be able to sustain human bondage. Really, it's not possible without those. How do you talk about that with seventh graders? I don't know, but I think what might be a way to do that is to kind of give them the control in that, you know, looking at the census record of, for example, and all of that is online, and you can look at Kinderhook and you can see the family names. What struck me as I was going through them is that the Van Alstyne, I don't know how you say it in English. Alstyne. They, almost every member of the Van Alstyne family had enslaved people, and a significant number. It wasn't like 1 or 2 people, as you see with a lot of family. Many of them had 5 or more people that they held in bondage within their homes. So I think that that might be a way to actually give them that census record and kind of go through it, or go through some of the newspaper advertisements that are looking for these people. And I think that that will give them an insight into it, that if you just tell them, they might not really get it, but if they see that, I think it shows. And then translating these numbers, right? Like, yes, it's maybe 10% or 15% overall, but 25% of the families actually have people that they enslaved in their houses. In Kings County, it was close to 75% of places like New Utrecht and Flatbush. It's close to 75% of the families that enslaved people within their houses. And I think that those types of things really kind of make it, show the extent of it in a way that otherwise might not be visible. So those are some of the things, and showing the spaces, like to actually go into those spaces. And I think there's plenty of historic places where you can do that. If there's an opportunity to go to those spaces and kind of walk through them, it really changes how you see the history. And so, yeah, I think that those would be, but I'm not a 7th grade teacher, so.
But then, thank you.
But what you're saying is really particularly true. If you go to the Lucas Van Allen house, where I had heard they had at least 20 slaves, how could they have gotten 20 slaves in the house and visitors as well?
Mhm.
It looks like not even quite a starter home by today's traditions. It's like you could have maybe 2 adults, a couple of kids, and that's basically it.
Yeah.
So it's amazing that people were able to live in those spaces.
Yeah.
Okay. Another question? Go ahead.
And they shout out for the exhibit that's here, mass, like and I got to, see, oh, there was a colored school and colored. But I do have a question about spiritual passion and do you know of any other evidence of those in New York that people mentioned and there's other items that can be found in there?
You repeat the question?
If there's any other examples of these sachets, these pouches in New York. And so I'm thinking, I can't think of any of those, but there are other examples, like I said, of so there are, for example, there's in a kitchen area, like underneath the stairs, likely also where enslaved people lived, and I forget the exact location, but if you're interested, I could find it and share it, where it's drawn like a star or a cross was drawn on the wall, where really nobody would have seen that except for the people actually living there or working in that kitchen area. There's also in Albany, they found a coin that was used as an amulet, and we know that because it had holes in it, so you could wear it, that had a cross on it. And again, the cross is a very important symbol in many African cultures, as well as, of course, European cultures, but especially in West Central Africa and the Kingdom of Congo and in those areas, it was very, it had a very important religious reason, symbolism. And those types of coins actually have also been found at 18th century burial grounds in the Congo. So that likely was an amulet worn by an enslaved people that had religious significance for them. And so there are other examples. I'm blanking on others now, but I've seen others within New York. But in the case of New York, there's fewer than we found in the South in archaeology of plantations there. But they do keep uncovering things like this. So there is more. And those are just a few of the examples that I off of that can think of. Yeah.
Rue, do you want to read some of the questions from the chat? I can't get them to come up here.
Sure. From Arrow Dyer, how does one find the names of those who held slaves?
So the enslavers, how do you find their names? So in 1790, it becomes very easy because of the first federal census. So you can actually find that online, download it and look through it and look at the different townships and counties and find their names and how many people they enslaved. You can also see that who live close to each other. And so what you'll often see is that there's pockets of people that enslaved people oftentimes living like closer to each other. You could also see that oftentimes families of free people. So if there are free people, free Black people, they oftentimes live also close to each other. I believe in Hudson, I noticed a group of people actually, being neighbors. So that's 1790, 1820, those census records are there. And then 1755, there's the Census of Slaves, I believe it's called. And that one is really interesting, but it doesn't include Columbia County. So it doesn't have all New York counties. But that one is really interesting because it doesn't just have the name of the enslaver, it also has the names of the people they enslaved. But it only lists adults, so it doesn't have children there. So you don't know the exact number that were enslaved by that family, just how many adults they had. But for many counties, not all of them, but for many counties, it will actually give you the names of the people they enslaved. So that one is a good one as well. And those are some of the easiest sources to work with. I mean, of course, if you go into the archives and you look through bills of sales and wills, you'll find that information that there as well. If they enslaved any people, it would be in those documents. But if you just, from home want to kind of have a sense of this, then I really recommend downloading the census records, because all of those you can just download and look at home. And it's very easy to kind of work your way through.
As a follow-up, how many on average did each family owns?
And say, so it really varies. In most cases in New York, the number is below 5. But I actually noticed when looking at the census records of this area, especially Kinderhook and Hudson, that the people who enslaved actually oftentimes had more people. Like there were a lot of people who had more than 5 people that they enslaved. So, but it usually, like anything above 15 was unusual. So even above 10, but I actually saw a lot of people above 10, but a very few that have 15 or more people that they held in bondage. So it's those are the kind of the main numbers that you see the range. But when you look at census records of New York, more generally, like what you'll see is that most of them would have fewer than 5 people.
The patroons were further up around Rensselaer. They would have had many more slaves.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps that was being counted as which would include which would up the average number.
Yeah, maybe, but like I said, the Van Alstyne, is that how you say it?
Then also,
Many of them had enslaved more than 5 people.
Mhm.
And almost every person that had that last name enslaved people, and they all were, significant number of people that they enslaved in their household. So yeah, it ranges.
Yeah, the Van Alstyne name was very, very popular. A lot of people knew the Van Alstyne name. My parents are all from Kinderhook. And I remember when we used to come to visit our relatives, and the women would be gossiping. Sometimes they would stop the conversation if they were talking about well, now, which Van Alstyne are you talking about? The white Van Alstynes or the black Van Alstynes? Everybody, there were a lot of them.
Yeah.
And I think there still are, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
Yes. I was gonna, Peter, do you want to jump in here and talk about some of your experiences in doing the family history?
I have to make
Peter's on mute.
sure he can get through.
Because Peter has done our family history back to 1790 and has been able to document about 1,700 entries, and they're all from the Kinderhook area.
Let's see. Who's blind as that?
Yeah, okay, maybe we'll just pass.
I didn't know you wanted to have people speak. Might be able to- Peter, you should be able to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Um, So we found in the research that we've done for that goes back, we found quite a few records in the Dutch Reformed Church of I want to say it was called Musical. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right. But that's in the just north of Kinderhook. And they would note in the church records, which of the members were people of color. And we have records of those people going back to, I want to say, early 1800s. And to my knowledge, they were free at the time they were in the church, but I can't really verify that. I just posted a link to the chat. There's a website called the Northeast Slavery Records Index, which allows you to search by municipality, by name, and it doesn't give you a lot of records for the enslaved, because most of them didn't have names in the records, but it will list the slave owners. And they're growing it, but it does have a fair amount of information. In the census records, what you want to look for is something called the I believe it's called the slave schedule, and that's also online, but it's usually indexed separately from the census records. And obviously New York, it doesn't exist beyond about 1840, but in the period before that, it will list the owners of the enslaved, and it'll give you a count by age and gender, usually without any names listed. Now I seem to have lost my audio.
Yeah, we lost audio. Why do I hear myself? Everyone online can hear me, but they can't hear you.
People might not have felt comfortable in the Dutch Reformed Church. A lot of them didn't leave, even when they had a chance, when they started their own church in Chatham, the AME Zion Church in Chatham, and the one in Kinderhook. There were people that still stayed on as Dutch Reformed and were very proud to be Dutch Reformed.
Just to add to what he was saying, in response to the question earlier, something I didn't think of was that Jay College, like John Jay College, CUNY, right, in New York City, they also have, if you Google it, you can find it. They have a database where you can put in names, and actually it'll names of an enslaver, and I think also maybe enslaved people, and it'll pull up the information. I don't know, how extensive that database is, but the few times that I've put in names, it does actually give me information. So that's another place where you could go if you want to look for a specific family. You could look up there, and it has information. So it's very useful.
Another
We have
question.
several questions.
Okay.
Could you speak more about the religions that were practiced by Africans as evidenced by these artifacts?
Yeah, I mean, so it's various different African religions, and some of the interesting research that has been done by, for example, Sterling Stuckey, is that it shows that, of course, it's very diverse along the African coast, right? A lot of different people, a lot of different religions. What we see in the case of the Americas is that oftentimes those things that a lot of these people had in common with each other were the ones that were more likely to survive in the Americas. So for example, the ring shout can be traced to African religious practices. So so it's a wide variety of different religions, and then traditional African religions, as well as Islam and Christianity, and especially in West Central Africa. And a lot of the early enslaved people in New York were coming from West Central Africa, and their Christianity, in particular Catholicism, would have been very widespread by the 17th century. So a lot of people considered themselves Catholic by the time they were brought to the Americas, and we can see that from some of their names, like Isabella and Anthony, very Catholic names. But the evidence that we see in some of these spaces, like the Lot House, really, show some of these traditional religions, like, for example, the Wolof and the Senegambia would use these Grigri to safeguard themselves or certain spaces. Something that you still see in the Senegambia today. If you go to Senegal today, you'd still see that. And actually, toward the latter part of the 18th century, a lot of people were brought to New York from the Senegambia area. And a lot of those people also would have been Muslim. So I have not seen evidence of that in the case of New York, but I'm sure that if, I'm sure that they brought Islam with them as well. We have evidence from that in other parts of the Americas. And I should note that also in the early 18th century, there's a lot of people coming from Madagascar, a lot of people from Madagascar that are brought into New York. So actually late 17th century, I should say. So it's not all the Atlantic coast of Africa. It's actually also on the east side of the continent where people were coming from. But so it would have been a wide variety. And this is where, like, the same way that the ring shouts was common in a lot of those cultures, the same was with the gree or the cachet, like those types of pouches that were used, as was with crosses, which were also in many of these cultures very important symbols, religious symbols. And so we see those also reoccur in many different instances. So it's those religious parts that could be recognized by different people that were more likely to survive and continue in the American context.
Karen has a follow-up question. Sorry, it's a little delay. Could you spell the name of the researcher that did the African research on African religions?
Sterling Stuckey was the one that I just referred to. There's many others, but he has a really great book about this in the ring shout and kind of survival of African religions in the Americas. I say survival, continuance, whatever word best fits. But he's really great to read about that.
For Mary Ellen, is there documentation of how free Blacks used their living spaces as they became homeowners in the 1800s?
That's a great question, and it's not something I have looked at, so I can't speak to that. But I hope that people will be researching this. And I do know that Whitney Stewart is a scholar who looks at slavery in the antebellum South. And she does look at enslaved people, but she does look at homemaking. How did enslaved people try to turn these spaces that they lived in into a home? And so that research might actually give us an indication of how enslaved and then free people would organize their home spaces. But I have not researched that, but I would love to see that research. So.
Our next speaker, Myra Armstead, is going to talk about occupations of enslaved people and freed people. I don't know that she's talking about spaces and what they did with their spaces, but at least she's going to be talking about that.
Yeah.
Do we have another question from the audience? No? Okay. Rue, go ahead.
A lot of these are repeating, but I'm trying to get through them.
Well, I was just going to say, why don't we ask Peter and Lee and the others, do you have any comments you want to make so far? No? No? Okay. Go ahead, Rue.
Do you know why Dutch, German, Huguenot were particularly receptive to owning enslaved people as opposed to the early English settlers?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The early English settlers, I'm not really sure about that question. So, I don't know. I don't really like to think about it in terms of, there's a lot of conversation, like, were Dutch Americans more likely to enslave people? Were Dutch people better for the people they're enslaved, or were they worse? And those discussions also happened in the 18th century and in the early 19th century. So I've seen references from both. I've seen people in New York of Dutch descent say, I will send my enslaved people to an English colony or an English area if they're bad. And I've seen people in New England say the opposite about the Dutch, saying that, like if you really want to punish enslaved people, you send them to the Dutch. They all had slave systems. And in New York, in New England, in Virginia, right? And we can go on. And then, of course, in the Caribbean, the Dutch had Suriname, which at some point was known as the most brutal colony for enslaved people. So I think that in some cases it might be just a matter of money, like who has the wealth to actually own people, who might prefer to rely on enslaved people because of the types of labor or the type of work they're doing, or generational wealth. Like, in many of these cases, these people actually inherited enslaved people, right? And it was not easy in New York to actually manumit enslaved people. It was very complicated. So there might also be, like that once you have a family that enslaves people, that will likely continue, and unless you're going to sell them up, but you can't end the system, you can't end the system. So I know that Michael Dauma, if you're interested in this, he's working on this, and he claims that the Dutch were particularly resistant to abolishing slavery. And there is some evidence to suggest that in the case of New York, they were, but the English definitely did not hesitate to enslave people, right? So, and English descendants. So I think it really depends on the local circumstances.
Yeah, I don't know.
That would be my answer.
I don't know whether this answers the question. One of my majors in college was Afro-American Studies, and in class they had told us that they were originally, the settlers wanted to bring over white indentured servants, and they brought them over, but then they discovered that the indentured servants said, this work is a little hard, and they walked away. And then they decided that they would brand these people, and the people said, that's not going to happen either. So then they decided we need to find some people that look different. So if they escape, we can find them. And that's how they started bringing the slaves, the African slaves over. And the Africans themselves made it easier because the people that were being sold as slaves in Africa were prisoners of war. The African tribes had been fighting. And just like any of the other, like the Romans and everybody else, they took prisoners of war. And those prisoners of war became slaves, and so they sold them. And that's how they got a lot of the slaves, most of the slaves got here. The white settlers, from what I understand, and not white settlers, but the white slave ship holder, what they call them, captains, they did not leave the shore. They did not go into the interior of Africa to find their slaves. The slaves came to the shores, and then they were brought over.
Yeah. It's a complicated history.
Very complicated.
It's very complicated. And so, yeah, there's back in the day, there was the whole Tannenbaum thesis about, what slavery was better than another. And I mean, there is no good slavery, right? Like, it's all awful. So, it's, yeah.
And as we have time running out.
No,
what
we
if
have,
do.
I'm sorry, we have another question from the audience.
Yeah, you didn't really get into occupations, but what do you know about enslaved people working on the river on boats and ships or maritime?
Yeah, it happened. A lot of enslaved people and free people worked in the maritime. also a lot of free Black people. It was also one way to try to escape, right? That's why oftentimes in these advertisements, especially in New York, close to ports, there would be a warning to captains that, you know, they make sure this person is not hiding on their ships. So, and there's some great work that's being done on like maritime marinage and enslaved people working in that field. And if you're interested in reading from the perspective of an enslaved person, a lot of Equiano actually worked on ships for a long time, and he talks about this. Of course, not in the case of New York, but he does travel the Caribbean and in Virginia and along the Atlantic seaboard. So, yeah, they were working in those capacities as well on these ships, both locally as well as on the ocean. Yeah.
What can we do with this information, research, your lecture in our personal lives?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think what's really important is that there's an increased awareness of the extent of slavery and that it existed in New York, just as it did elsewhere. In fact, and I always bring this up because I think it is an important point. In Georgia, slavery as instituted by Europeans and European descendants didn't start until the 1750s. Like the institution of slavery wasn't legalized until the 1750s. And when we think of slavery, oftentimes tend to think of like the kind of the gone with the wind type of slavery, right? Which is located in Georgia. So slavery there existed for a little over 100 years. In New York, it existed for 200 years. So to always focus so much on the numbers of people enslaved, I think it loses the point that this was a society that was benefiting from the labor of enslaved people, and that also sustained a system of bondage. And everybody, all three people had in some way to take part in that to be able to sustain that system. And so it was integral to society, it was integral to New York culture. And I think that that is important to take into account. I don't know how, you know, what to do with that in our lives now. But I mean, we see the remnants of this still today. I mean, when we talk about the policing of Black people in public spaces, we can trace that to that early history where any white person could stop any Black person to demand that they provide evidence of them being in these spaces legitimately. We still see that happening today. And so I think that history continues until today, and we understand really the past, and hopefully that can also make us more aware of why things are happening and perhaps how we can change them. But that's, and I guess the generational wealth is an important part of that as well, right? And kind of thinking through that and how there might be ways to address that. So, yeah, that's I guess that's it. That's all I have for that.
As a Black person, I'd like to say that it's important to me to know my history. Growing up, I didn't have a history. You know, people, my 8th grade American history teacher said, when I asked her, well, what did Black people do? Or we were Negroes at that point. She said nothing. And I was like, really? I was devastated because she had just gone around the whole class and asked each one what their heritage was, and then told them what their forefathers had done. And my forefathers hadn't done anything. It wasn't until I got to college that I was like, okay, I guess we did some things. And then I got to Kinderhook and walked the streets and said, hey, my town, I understand this village. You know, I looked at the headstones in the people of color cemetery. 5 of those headstones are my relatives. That makes me think like, wow, I belong here. I'm really happy here. Yeah. So, you know, I this whole thing of hatred and stuff, I don't get that. You know, I'm like, oh, home, I found. Okay. Okay. Any more questions or?
I have more online if we want to keep on going.
You want to keep on going?
I mean, I'm either way. I heard somebody say no.
Just check the time.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Check the time because you don't want to miss your train.
By the way, you have a comment. Your book is extraordinary. Are you working on another?
Yeah, can I, well, maybe that could be a good conclusion too, right? To talk about the next project. So my next book, and it was mentioned in the introduction, but I'm looking at the slave ship, the Gideon. This was a Dutch ship chartered by the Dutch West India Company that arrives in New York City in 1664, just before the English take over the colony. And they actually confiscate a large part of the enslaved people that arrive on board the Gideon. And Stuyvesant actually blames in part the takeover of the English on the poor health of these enslaved people. He says that they, because they are in such poor health when they arrive, he has to give many of the provisions to them to regain their health that he otherwise would have used for the troops that then could have, stopped the English. So it's a very interesting kind of example or a moment in New York history, not an example, a moment in New York history. It's also the first Dutch West India Company chartered ship that brings so many enslaved people into the harbor. 290 people are brought into the harbor with that ship. And so what I'm doing is to use that ship and that moment, that voyage, to kind of tell a broader history of the role of the Dutch West India Company in expansion of the transatlantic slave trade during the 17th century. We see that this is the moment where they develop Curacao into a slave entrepot, where they really turn slave trading into a business, selling enslaved people to the Spanish and to other Dutch colonies. And so that's what I'm working on now. So more to come on that.
Okay, on that note, we want to thank you ever so much for coming. And it's wonderful as usual, and we're looking forward to your second book. I particularly am looking forward to it.
Thank you.
I would also